Well, in the last video, we were talking about the Missouri Compromise and how the Missouri Compromise here, that this line was the deciding line where slavery would be allowed and where non-slavery was going to be in our country. And that lasted for 30 years. And 6 new states joined the Union. It kept the balance between the free states, and it kept the balance between the slave states equal in the government. And so then we come up to the problem, we discussed it last time, of California wanting to be part of the Union. And California wanted to come in as a free state. So now the balance of power is upset, and all this compromise had to be done. And you really, the two different sides are really beginning to get jacked up by this time. And especially you have some real abolitionist movements in the North. And the South, as they see these abolitionist movements and they're putting out newspapers and handbills and pamphlets, the South is looking at that as a direct threat against their lifestyle. And so there is becoming more and more division between the two. So you have the representatives and the senators in Congress meeting together and trying to figure out, how do we compromise with this? What do we do with this? And so they come up, Congress comes up with a final compromise, and this is just a little review from the last one. And the North gets California as a free state. And the slave trade is banned in the United States capital, D.C. What the South gets is Congress has no power to regulate slave trade between the states. Remember, it was put, in order to get the Constitution signed by the southern states, they had to agree to a certain year, so many years that they could import slaves, and then it would become illegal to import slaves into the United States. But they had never had any restrictions, Congress never had any say-so, on how trading and buying and selling slaves between the states, not as an import, but between the states, would be. And so the South wanted to really confirm that Congress, you can't tell us how we are going to trade our slaves, our people. The next point that the South gets is, in all these new territories that were won in our war with Mexico, that all of these are going to be decided, whether there'll be slavery or not, by popular sovereignty. And what they mean by that is that the people who go in and settle will vote, and they will determine and decide who, if they want their area to have slavery or not. To the North, this was frightening, because they see the South as wanting to infiltrate slavery throughout the whole country. In the South, it became an idea of property rights, and we have the right to determine our lifestyle. So the South gets the popular sovereignty, the idea that in these different territories, as they get populated and apply for statehood, that they would be able to determine whether they want slavery. The South also got something that was very difficult for the North to handle, especially the abolitionists in the North, and that was the Fugitive Slave Act. And under that, any person in the North that is accused by a runaway slave catcher, or anybody in the North a Southerner come up into the North and say, that person is my slave, my runaway slave, even though they may have been a free person living up there for 10, 15, 20 years. They would be seized, not with a trial, and returned to the South. And so all you needed was another witness to affirm that this person was a slave, and they would be arrested, confined, and then transported back to the South. So any slave that was, any African-American person could be in the situation of being accused. And if you lived in the North and you knew they were a runaway slave, and you did nothing to help them have that property returned, then you could be arrested too. So this was something that really got the Northerners. And there weren't, you know, there were a lot of Northerners that really, they didn't like slavery, but they never met a slave, never really saw or knew the conditions. They just were against it on principle. There wasn't a real emotional buy-in that I hate this practice, and that there's an ethical or morality to it, that it's wrong on some level. And so the North felt really like, you can't force us, if we don't believe in slavery, to have to return these people. So now the tensions are getting higher. What about the Compromise of 1850 that really pulled them apart? It was the Fugitive Slave Law. Many Northerners and abolitionists just resented and hated the idea that if they really in their heart were against it, that they by law were going to be forced to help push or return those slaves back. And here are the two open territories that could be decided by popular sovereignty, which really blow away that compromise, the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And so this looks very, to the north, like a big, slavery is really infiltrating a lot of the country. They really hated the Fugitive Slave Law. And as I'm talking, make sure you understand these points, what the Fugitive Slave Law consisted of. Make sure you know those. So under the Compromise of 1850, here is the map of the continent, and here are these territories that are left to decide. California is a free state, and these red numbers are the percentage of slaves in relation to the population, of the total population. So out of the total population of South Carolina, more than half, 57%, are slaves. So you're going to be able to, you can extrapolate or just look at some of these numbers and make some predictions on which of these states that have slaves are going to be more likely to be agitated towards the north and feel that they're being more attacked. And it's obviously going to be the ones that probably the ones that have a higher percentage of their population as slaves. But now, a couple years later, there's a lot of difficulty about the Fugitive Slave Act. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, she is quite the woman. She was the daughter of a pastor. And she lived on a border state, and then she got married and she moved. And she had seen firsthand some of the conditions of slaves as the runaway ones came across, even though she lived in the north. She also experienced during one of the epidemics that went through the country periodically, is she lost her son. And it killed her to think of what it would be like with her grief over her own child, what it would be like to have somebody take your child and sell that. And so, in losing her own child, she grew a huge empathy for slave women and the dividing and the tearing apart of slave families. So she wrote a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it's the story of a slave owner selling his slaves, her identification with losing your child, and how one of the slaves to be sold is taken by his mother to run away to the north. And so much of this story revolves around the loss of her own child. As this story went out, the book was a bestseller. It was hugely popular. Plays were made into it. And Northerners, when they saw in the play and read some of these details about exactly what slavery could do, kind of like the nuts and bolts of slavery, what it looked like in the everyday life, how some slave owners could treat their slaves. The Northerners were shocked. It was like seeing something they never quite realized before. And now, the Northerners were shocked and convinced slavery was not just a political conflict, but now the idea of selling the children away from the moms and things like that, it has become a moral issue that kind of brings it to a higher level. Not just I disagree with your opinion, but now I'm beginning to believe that this is morally wrong at some level, that you just can't do that. And so, to the South, it was pure propaganda. And we'll look into this more in the next video.